We're busting through the book of Ecclesiastes, and by busting through, I mean we're crawling through it, but we're walking. And you got to crawl before you learn how to walk. And so here we are in the 11th chapter of the book of Ecclesiastes, asking the question, what is life? And as we were asking that, we had this conversation in teaching team, and I became aware of something that I did that I've never thought about that I did, okay? And it's that I collect candles. Okay, now hear me. Like, I have a shelf in my hall closet that is full of candles. Some of the candles on that shelf are like every bit of 7 years old. Like some of them we might have even moved, when we moved from Lake of the Ozarks, like might have come with us from Lake of the Ozarks, and there's like that much wax, and I don't know what we're saving it for, but it's there. I don't know, I have all of these, like, candles that I collect, and then I started thinking, like, why? Like, why do I have all these candles? And then I started thinking about all the reasons why I don't burn them. Like, sometimes I'll say, well, I want to save this candle for a special occasion. Like, what does that even mean? It's cinnamon. What is special about cinnamon? Like, I'll say that, or I'll say, like, it's too late to burn the candle. It's 7:30 and I'm going to be asleep in an hour and a half. Like, so I'll wait, or I'll say that it's too early to burn the candle because it's 6:30 in the morning. And who burns a candle at 6:30 in the morning? And I come up with all these reasons not to burn candles, and then I just accumulate them, and now they're on a shelf in my closet. And this is what struck me. You buy candles to burn them, not to store them. And so in me storing these candles, like I legit am missing out on the purpose with which they were created for. Candles are made to burn, they are not made to store. And as I was thinking about the text this morning, it's a text that really encourages action. That it's a text that essentially is saying, like, hey, don't wait to do the things that God has asked you to do. Because there are some things in our lives where, there isn't a lot of question, that God would just say, no, this is what you do. And then there are some things that are slower to figure out. And what this text does is it points out the things that we are told clearly to do in Scripture, and the idea is don't wait to do the things that God wants you to do today. And you see that here in Ecclesiastes chapter 11. If you got a Bible, you can get there. If not, it's okay. It'll be on the screen. This is at Ecclesiastes chapter 11, verse 1. It says this. It says, "Cast your bread upon the waters, for you will find it after many days. Give a portion to 7 or to 8, for you do not know what disaster may happen on earth." Let's just be honest, that is the 2020 verse, right? Like, you do not know what disaster may happen on earth. Welcome to the year 2020. But here's the idea. So he's saying this stuff. He's kind of saying some cultural things. And he gives us, we'll see throughout the course of this text, 3 things that we shouldn't wait to do. And the first thing we see here is we see you shouldn't wait to be generous. That you shouldn't wait to be generous. Now, through my conversations with people throughout the years, one of the things that I have discovered is that we are really good at talking ourselves out of generosity. And usually we talk ourselves out of it by falling into one of 2 camps. We talk ourselves out of it by maybe being the saver, or we talk ourselves out of generosity by being the overspender. I don't need to tell you what camp you fall into, and if you don't know, just ask your spouse, they'll tell you. And so if you're in this camp where you're an oversaver and you want to be generous, but you don't, here's what I can tell you. There will never be an amount of money where you will say, now I can do this. It's not going to happen. Like, I hear people tell me all the time, they say, well, you know what, I'm I don't tithe, but if I win the lottery, that's when I'll start. There is no way you'll start. Do you know what 10% of 10 million is? It's $1 million. There's no way in the world that's going to happen. But we say, no, as soon as this happens, then I will. And if you're like me, I fall into this camp. Okay? Here's what I can tell you in this camp. There is always another project to be done. There is always another disaster that could come that you need to prepare for. And generally speaking, you can talk yourselves into realizing things are going to be way more expensive than you originally anticipated. So if you fall into this camp, there's never going to be a moment where you're like, all right, there it is, I can do this. Then there's the group that's the overspenders, okay? And I think that you want to be generous too, but here's where you're going to have a hard time with it. There's always another toy. There's always something else that you're like, man, I'd really like that. And this is what you say. You say, okay, I'm going to be generous. This is something that I'm going to do, but first I got to buy this thing, and here's what I can tell you about that thing. It's going to be really fun for about 2 or 3 weeks, and then you're going to find another thing that you want to get. And this is why, as Solomon is talking about something like generosity, this is why he says, don't wait. This is why he says, hey, you're gonna be able to talk yourself out of this thing. That's why he uses the word cast. It's the idea, well, no, you do it. And even the premise behind what he is saying is something that's so beautiful that if you are someone who is generous, you have experienced for yourself. And like I said, this is a cultural expression where he says to cast your bread upon the waters. Obviously, that is probably I don't know that it's advocating to throw a piece of pita in the Finley. That's probably not going to work out. It's not a great way to store bread either, probably, if we were to be really honest. I just keep it in the pantry. But you see some of the idea conveyed in an African proverb that I found that was written about the same time, and it says this. It says, do a good deed and throw it into the river, and when it dries up, you shall find it. That the idea of casting your bread into the water, that seems like a foolish thing to do with your bread. Especially when in that day, bread's hard to come by, throwing, that's crazy. And what Solomon is saying, he's saying, when you do that, you don't lose it. That when you're generous, when you lend freely, when you give, when you're committed to taking things that are yours and using that to bless other people, that you actually never lose those things. And I like the imagery of casting the bread upon the water. And the reason why I like it is because that's something that would be difficult to do. And when you think about giving, when you think about generosity, sometimes doesn't it feel like just throwing bread in a river? I don't know what's going to happen. I'm just going to do it. And the idea is that when you do this, you actually don't lose anything at all. And as I think about this season in the life of our church, it has been unique to say the least, okay? And the part of it that has been so amazing to me is how everything that I heard probably, was that 15, 20 weeks ago, it all runs together now, was man, brace, buckle up, churches. It's going to be hard. Buckle up. This is going to be a tough season to be in the ministry. And I think about New Life Church, and I'm like, for us, that wasn't the story. That for us during this season, we've actually seen incredible generosity through the people who call this place home, so much so that during this season where really we were just supposed to shut down and give up, we were able to update our camera equipment. That last week, and you may think, well, what's the big deal with camera equipment? Well, it's a huge deal for people who have to watch us online because they feel uncomfortable coming out. That last week, between YouTube and Facebook, we had 80 people watching at one time. When you multiply that by 2, that's a pretty good sized service. And honestly, we had more than the week before. Why do you think people are coming back? Because it's better. Like, your generosity enabled us to create something that was better so that people who don't feel comfortable coming out can still know Jesus better at a level that that we're not making it more difficult for them. Like, that happened. That as a result of your generosity during this season, we were able to completely update our stage. Like, we needed to do it. We've been talking about doing it for about the last 7 or 8 years. We've been saying, hey, man, isn't it weird that a drum cage is our focal point? Like, and now finally we were able to do that. We were able to paint this room, brightens it up a ton. That stuff makes a huge difference. It was able to happen because of your generosity. But not only that, but like, if you remember pre-COVID, the stage was incredibly dark. Like, you couldn't make out my facial expressions. I had this green hue to me, which was really cool when I was trying to be strong like the Hulk, but at the end of the day, I couldn't be seen. And so we were able to update our lighting system because of your generosity during the season. But not only all of that, which is incredible, but here's what I can tell you too. We created a site for anybody that needed help during the COVID season. And we were able to meet every single benevolence request that came in during that time. Some people from our church, some people who we've never met before. Like, and so cast your bread upon the waters. Like, you can do that. It's not lost. That it's going to something else. That we're at a place where, if you remember our business meeting, we were talking about how we wanted to update the kids stage, but it didn't make the budget this year. That if we have a good June, we're going to be able to update the kids stage by the fall when they're coming back in for school. Like, when you give, when you cast your bread upon the waters, yes, it is something that takes faith, but Solomon's saying you don't lose it when you do. So don't wait to do it. You also see this idea where he's saying as well, like, you also don't want to wait to be generous because you never know when you're going to need to be the recipient of generosity. Like, you never know. Like, you never know when the time's going to come where you're going to need it. And you might think that sounds strange, but the law of the harvest, you see it in Galatians chapter 6, it says that you reap what you sow. That you can just become, like, and it says whoever sows sparingly will also reap sparingly, but whoever sows generously will also reap generously. And the idea there, and that's in verse 2, is one that says, you give because you never know when you're going to need. And Solomon, in his other book, the book of Proverbs, he says it this way. He says, whoever is generous to the poor lends to the Lord, and he will repay him for his deed. When you're like, the Lord repays you. Jesus says it this way in Luke's gospel, in Luke chapter 6, verse 38. It says, for with the measure you use, it will be measured back to you. That the thing is with generosity, that it is something that you will always be able to talk yourself out of, but the best way to start is to start. So don't wait. The thing you see here in the text, to not wait to do, is to not wait until you understand everything. Or you could say it this way, like, don't wait to act until the conditions are perfect. We live in a society that kind of seems to think, sometimes they think that the answer to all of the world's problems are more knowledge and more information. And while I don't think that, like, knowledge is a bad thing, obviously this is a wisdom book, so there are benefits to wisdom. The truth is, though, that, like, there comes a point where you got to stop collecting information and you just got to act. There are some things in life that you're not really, like, fully going to be able to understand it until you do it. And some of our tendency, and I don't know that this is all of our tendency, but some of our tendency is to say, okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to really wait until I get this before I go. And in your waiting, you miss the thing that you're supposed to do. I remember my dad told me this, and now as I think about it, I think he did it just because he wanted grandkids. But when Joey and I were talking about having kids, he told me, he said, you know, Ryan, you're never going to be fully ready to have kids. Like, there are just some things about having kids that you'll never be ready for. And all the parents are like, yep, that's true. I mean, I'm like a few nights ago, at dinner at our house is a fight. Like, that's just how it goes. Like, it's a fight. And especially with my daughter. And we were really excited because she came out and she showed us her plate, and it was like there was nothing on there. And so we're like, oh, Madeline, that's so great. We're so proud. Like, you ate your food. This is awesome. And then I was like, I went to the bathroom, and I noticed, those bathrooms, trash cans that don't have a lid, but kids think you should put things in there that smell bad. You know what I'm talking about? I look in there, and Madeline's dinner is in that trash can. Okay, so, like, there's no book that's going to prepare me for that moment. Because, like, on the one hand, like, it's really funny. Like, I'm like, did you really think I wasn't going to see the lasagna in there? Like, and so, like you can't prepare, and that's the idea. Like, there's just some things that you're not going to be able to figure out. Like, you just got to kind of go. And Solomon, like, he shows us this. Look at this here in chapter 11, verse 3. He says that the clouds are full of rain. They empty themselves on the earth. And if a tree falls to the south or to the north, in the place where the tree falls, there it will lie. Yep, that's how it works. He who observes the wind will not sow, and he who regards the clouds will not reap. Now, I like Solomon. I like that he's a fan of working hard. Last week, he talked about how, like, your roof caves in because of sloth, that he's very much a fan of, like, working hard. I don't think that is a picture of sloth as much as it is the picture of unreasonably collecting information. That this is a picture of someone who walks out and says, I know I should plant today, but there's a cloud in the sky. I'm going to go back in and read more about planting. And then they go back out the next day and they're like, there's no clouds in the sky. And they go back inside and they read more about planting. And then they walk out again and the sky's full of clouds and they're like, I don't think so. There's too many clouds. And then what ends up happening is because they're waiting for the perfect moment, they end up not doing what they're supposed to do. Now, if you look at this in context of the book, it's some people need to be diligent. Some people need to work on, like, not being so hasty. Like last week we talked about a guy who digs a pit and falls in the pit that he digs. Like, that's someone who could probably maybe go look at the sky once or twice. But this is really the beauty of Scripture, because what it's doing is it's showing us really two sides of the same coin. That some people are too hasty. And some people are too slow. And you got to figure out which one you are. Solomon shows the proper response here in verse 6, where he says, in the morning, sow your seed, and at evening do not withhold your hand, for you do not know which will prosper, this or that, or whether both alike will be good. I like the way that Douglas Sean O'Donnell says it in his commentary on the book of Ecclesiastes. He says that ignorance is no excuse for idleness. That there comes a point where you just got to go out and plant the seed. Like, there comes a point where you got to act, you got to do something. And we flesh this out a lot of different ways, but I think specifically one of the ways that, there's a couple ways we flesh this out. One is that we'll use, as I've talked about, that we'll use information gathering as a way to paralyze action. That, you know what you need, you know what you need to do. You know what needs to happen. You are aware of the options. You have been thorough. But instead of doing something, you want to be really sure. When there comes a point as we make decisions where you've probably gathered all the information that you need to gather, that you've probably heard all of the opinions that you need to hear. There probably aren't a million ways you could respond to that are realistic. Like you know, but instead of acting, you say, I'm just going to be really sure and I'm going to... And the thought behind it is, well, I can't be wrong if I don't do anything. And to that, Solomon would say, oh, yes, you can. Sometimes it is wrong to not do anything, especially when you just need to go out and do something. And this could happen with all kinds of things. This could be like maybe you're trying to figure out if you should switch jobs. Like you've done this, you've done the research, you're trying to figure it out. Like you know the options, so what are you going to do? Maybe you're trying to figure out God's will for your life, and you know the options. You kind of know the paths that are before you, and you're anything less than an audible voice. You're like, I'm just going to keep waiting. And so we got to be careful. Like, don't be the guy that just keeps going out saying now's not a good time to plant, because eventually you need to plant. The other thing you see, or the other way we could apply this would be that you use information as a way to cover up laziness. That you use information gathering as a way to cover up work that might be hard. I mean, I imagine going back to the planter in the story. I mean, it's much easier to go out and look at the sky and say it's not a good day than to spend a day planting seed. It's much easier to sit down and read that book than it is to go out and do the work. That it's a lot easier to, in your pursuit of the perfect situation and the perfect opportunity, to just say, I'm going to do nothing and just wait for the perfect thing, and when maybe there's plenty of good things that are in front of you that you should just go ahead and do. That Solomon is saying, don't wait. Don't wait for the perfect conditions for action. Sometimes you just need to go. You just need to give it a shot. Be thorough, be smart, but after you've considered it, like in anything, there's always going to be a little bit of risk. Don't think that your situation's any different than everyone else's. So people do this with decision making, but Solomon helps us see that we also do this when it comes to our relationship with God. I imagine there are probably people in this room where maybe God is calling you to a greater level of commitment, where there are things that you know that God wants you to do that you're not doing. And instead of doing what God wants you to do, or being the person that God wants you to be, or maybe even putting your faith in Jesus Christ, you're waiting to try to understand Him. That you're waiting until the conditions are perfect so that it's really easy to make that decision. And what Solomon wants us to see is he wants us to see that, that doesn't always work with God either. That there are things about Him and things about His working that as hard as we try, we're still not going to be able to understand. Look at this in verse 5. He says this. He says, as you do not know the way the Spirit comes to the bones of a womb, or of a woman with child, so you do not know the work of God who makes everything. And then in verse 7, he says, light is sweet, that it is pleasant for the eyes to see the sun. But there's just some things about Him that we can't understand. I mean, even the second part there, we're talking about how light is pleasant, like there's something about pleasant about seeing this. Like, we don't know why, but sometimes you walk outside and it's sunny and it just feels good, doesn't it? Like in the breeze of the morning. Some things I like about 8 o'clock services that I'm hanging out there and it's nice and cool, and and it's like, oh man, this just feels like, why? Why does it feel? We don't know. Like there's just something about it that just feels good. Even when you think about the part where it's talking about a child in the womb. Like we know a lot more about this process today than Solomon knew when he wrote it. I remember when my wife was pregnant with our kids, she got the email saying like, all right, it's a grapefruit. Like that, like you know what I'm talking about. Like there are things that we know and there are things that we understand, but there are also things that we can't explain. I mean, seriously, how does a soul animate a body? How do you bring life to blood and bones? We can't explain that, but we know that it happens. And what Solomon is, he's looking at life, and he's saying, there are some things that happen that you just don't know why. There's a God in heaven who's greater than you, and you're not going to be able to understand everything that he does. And the truth is that the second that we figure him out, talking about God, the second he ceases to be God, because he wouldn't be God if he was something that we could figure out. And that doesn't mean that we should check our brains at the door. That doesn't mean that we should not be thorough in our pursuit of God or our desire to know him. But it also means that if you're wanting to completely remove the element of faith to God, you're not. Because if you remove that, you wouldn't have to trust him, and Jesus wants you to trust him. So we can't wait until the conditions are perfect or until we understand everything. And then the last thing that we see here in the text is we see that we can't wait to enjoy our lives. We should not wait to enjoy our lives. Look at this in verse 8. So if a person lives many years, let him rejoice in them all. But let him remember that the days of darkness will be many, and all that comes is vanity. Rejoice, O young man, in your youth. Let your heart cheer you in the days of your youth. Walk in the ways of your heart and in the sight of your eyes, but know that for all these things God will bring you into judgment. Remove vexation from your heart and put away from your body, for youth and the dawn of life are vanity. Now, if you look at verse 8, that really is that's the book of Ecclesiastes. That's it. If you were to describe everything that we've been talking about, it's really it. It's okay, in life, there's good things happening to you. There are bad things that are happening as well. Both are happening at the same time. You pick what you want to think about. You pick what you want to focus on. You get to decide what you want to do with life. It's really your call with what you want to think about. That's it. In life, there's good, and in life, there's bad. I was thinking about this week for me, and sometimes in ministry, there's this weeks that are heavy. There are weeks where you're like, man, it doesn't stop. You're like, whoa, another evening meeting. Okay, all right. And then, there's another phone. Okay, yep. And it happens. There are weeks where that's the case. And I remember I'm sitting there on Thursday. I just told Joanna, I was like, babe, I'm going to have to work a little bit on my day off this week. I'm just slammed. And so Joanna, she comes in and helps Pastor Ashley get the seating chart ready on Thursdays. And so that means that on Thursdays, my kids are here. So, and they're really, honestly, based on, I know that the stories I tell about them aren't always they're actually pretty good kids. And they were hanging out in the 3-year-old classroom. And I'm sitting there, and I've got so much work to do, so many things. I'm like, man, I got to get this thing. And I'm like, but my kids are here. I'm like, eventually we're going to stop doing the seating chart thing, I think. Maybe not. Maybe we'll do it forever. But eventually we'll stop. Eventually they won't be here on a Thursday. Eventually, and so I'm like, man, I have an opportunity here where I could just kind of dive in and just, crush out another task, or I could make the most of a situation. The kids are here, and so the beauty of being a lead pastor is that you know where all the candy's at, okay? And so I go in the 3-year-old classroom where they're playing, and I'm like, hey guys, put your shoes on and come with me. And they think they're in trouble, which is kind of fun for me in the moment. Because they're like, oh no, he saw me climb on that shelf, or whatever the thing they might have been doing. So I'm like, come with, let's go. And I'm like, and so we're marching, because the candy's stored in the youth building. Don't tell Ryan I took it from there. And so the candy's over there, and so we march out the front door. I look at Marsha, because she's kind of the gatekeeper to the building, and I'm like, don't ask any questions. And she's like, why would I ask any questions? And Jack points at her, and he said, that's a question. And we just keep going. And we get in the building, we kind of look through, we pilfer through their candy, and we grab something and we go back and we sit in my office and we eat it, and it's like some sugary, sticky, nasty thing, and for whatever reason, they're sitting on my lap, touching my face, and it's a COVID nightmare if they weren't my kids. And they're touching my keyboard, and I have one of those mouse pads, it's all sticky, and it was a moment. It was something that I was able to do in the midst of a situation. Good and bad are both happening at the same time, but it was an opportunity to make the most. And here's the thing about your life. Good and bad are happening at the same time. That you get the choice what you want to do with the moments that come your way. That you get the choice whether or not you're going to maximize something and make it special, or if you're just going to fixate on the things that are frustrating you. Both things are happening, but how you respond to them is your call. And you see a lot of this idea throughout. As he sits there and he talks about youth. He's saying, when he says, rejoice, young man, in your youth, he's saying, hey, don't live your life constantly thinking that the next season's going to be better than the one you're in. That don't be thinking, when you're young and you're in college and you don't have as much stress, don't be thinking, man, I can't wait till adulthood comes. That when your kids are young, don't be saying, man, I just can't wait till they get a little bit older, because when they get a little bit older, they're going to get a little bit easier. They're going to get a little bit easier. Because all the parents who have older kids are like, yeah, that doesn't happen. That in every season, there are things that you can enjoy, and there are going to be things that are going to stress you out. And he talks specifically to youth, and the reason why he talks specifically to youth, because he's saying, well, this is something that you need to figure out when you're young. That if you can learn this discipline when you're young, then it's going to go with you when you're older. That it's going to go with you when you face the challenges of your 20s and your 30s and your 40s, because it's a muscle that you've exercised when you were young. And he gives us the key. He says the way that you do this is that you remove vexation from your heart. And it kind of comes down to, well, what do you think about when you have nothing else to think about? Do you think about all the things that are stressing you out? You think about all the things that are frustrating with you? Are you thinking about everything that's making you mad? Or do you think about how you've got a lot to be thankful for? Do you think about how the Lord has provided for you? Do you think about how He has taken care of you and how He will continue to take care of you? That's how you remove the vexation from your heart. It's not as easy as just stopping, because if it was easy as just stopping, I don't think any of us would do it. But it's a matter of disciplining our thoughts, choosing what we want to think about. And if we can do that, then we don't have to wait to enjoy our lives. And so as I close this morning, I think about the book. I think about the question, what is life? And so much of what we have done, so much of this question that we have asked has been high level. And this is actually a very practical look at life. That these are all things that you can do now. These are all things that you don't have to wait to do. That you don't have to wait to do something fun when you go home. That you don't have to wait to stop trying to figure everything out, and you don't have to wait to be generous. So if we were to look at what Solomon is saying, what is he saying? He is saying, burn your candles. He's saying, stop waiting. Stop putting things off that you know that you need to do. There's no discussion about this stuff, so you might as well just trust the Lord and do what He says. I like the way that Jesus' brother James says it in his letter in our New Testament. He says this, he says, so whoever knows the right thing to do and fails to do it, for him it is sin. So what is the Lord calling you to do? What is that thing that you need to stop thinking about? What is He asking you to do? And when you go home tonight, as you process this, or even when you get in your car, stop thinking about it. Do it. And you'll be glad you did.